In Sons of the Soil, a group of Ukrainian immigrants come to Western Canada to claim the homesteads that they were promised by Canadian agents. Their lives consist of turning that virgin land into fields. Out of this furnace, families of Greek Catholic Slovaks come to work in the smelters of Western Pennsylvania. Both of these peoples came from neighboring lands, and they are essentially similar. There was probably a portrait of the Austrian Empire Franz Josef on the walls of all of their homes. Their languages resemble each other, and the same political and economic constraints drove them to emigrate. They will work hard to secure a better future for their children. It should be interesting to compare the lives of the protagonists in these two novels, which both span 3 generations of immigrant life. The narrower aim of this paper will be to determine the moment in each novel when they begin to feel rooted in the new lands. That is, their moment of ceasing to be immigrants. The 4 Galician families, Vorkun, Vakar, Dub, and Solovi, arrived together. Sometime at the turn of the century, they get off at the last train station and continue west by Indian Trail. It is assumed that they come to Alberta, but it could be anywhere on the Western Plains. With the help of an already established Postal family, they form a microscopic community encircled by forests. A 3-day ride away by oxen, there is a town where they go occasionally to buy farm animals and supplies or to find temporary jobs. That town is not named. It is the outside world from which they quickly return to their settlement, the real world of the novel. Out of this furnace, George Knacha arrives in the fall of 1881 and settles in the industrial town of Braddock on the Allegheny River, 10 miles north of Pittsburgh. He, his family, and thousands such as he immediately become part of an immense anthill of laborers as they rub shoulders with the Irish and other workers, stoking the constant fires of the smelters. This exact geographic and physical delimitation is the first contrast between the novels. The challenges. In both novels, the lives of the protagonists are difficult. In the first, the enemy is nature. The struggle to clear the land of trees, to force the soil to produce food, was immense. Ironically and unfortunately, these Galicians chose well-forested lands because back home, only the Didich owned forests, and they were a great source of wealth. The settlers take their squares of 160 acres and spend their lives struggling with them. At the point where their lands meet, there will be a school and a church, their communal possessions. The combat with nature consists of tearing out the tree stumps, of surviving the harsh prairie winter, and even of not going insane from the buzzing of insects. Once subdued, however, nature offers its blessings and the land yields harvests. The labor is constant, but the farmer can see the sky and the sun as he plows his furrow. There is a love of horses and other animals. Although neighbors live at great distances which would be unthinkable in the villages at home, there is a spirit of community, of mutual help. Out of this furnace, the enemy is industry. In Braddock, we read in the book, it was an exceptional month which did not see a man crippled or killed outright. American industry, for all its boasting, was still crude and wasteful in its methods. And part of the cost of its education, of that technique, it was in time to consider somewhat smugly as a unique American heritage, a gift of God to the corporations of America, was the lives and bodies of thousands of its workers, end of quote. The men worked 7 12-hour days a week. They lived crowded in dingy houses, in the shadow of the huge smelters, and the lands around them had gone barren a long time ago and were covered with shale. Like nature in the first novel, industry also fed its people, but the effects on the human psyche was devastating. Quote, when he, Kracha, rose late in the afternoon, there was little time to do anything. He usually got drunk. Only whiskey could pierce the shell of his weariness, warm him, make him think well of himself and of his world again. End of quote. For the ultimate toll which this labor sometimes exacted of its workers, we shall look at the scene where Kracha carries out the limp body of his friend Dubik after a fatal fire accident. Quote, he grasped Dubik's wrist to help him up and felt the skin slide out from under his fingers like a wet label on a bottle. The labor of the protagonists in both novels is difficult, but there is a difference of degree, of circumstances, and of the effect on them as human beings. Purpose in writing. The style of Kuriak's Sons of the Soil includes a paradoxical element. In some ways, it is an intimate narrative and reminiscences of old Vorkun, the natural leader of the group, at the end of his life. But usually Vorkun's voice refers to a third-person narrator. The novel is a roman à thèse, a novel with an assignment. Kuriak wants to show how essentially good these pioneers are. He wanted to wash, if not to whitewash, their image and to raise their self-image the self-image of these Ukrainians, settlers of the prairie. He created an idyllic world. In evaluating the style of Kuriak, Mandryka includes a comparison with the style of Tolstoy. While this is debatable, there is a Yasnaya Polana quality in the microcosm which Kuriak created. In their isolation, the settlers were oblivious of the outside world. They speak Ukrainian, but there is no attempt at political self-identification. They love their church, their language, and their ways simply because they are theirs. By omitting details and particularities, such as the name of the village they came from, the author made the novel more representative, more inclusive of various settlers, Galicians, Bukovinians, etc. Kuriak spares them and us any possible negative perceptions. Negative perceptions of them by the outside world. No one calls them names or laughs at their sheepskin coats. No one thinks that they are strange in their ways. Everyone likes them. The young girls go to work in domestic service and are treated like daughters, etc. All in all, the expectations these settlers have of their new land cease to be fulfilled. In the meantime, the land is very worried about them. The Anglo-Canadian officially designates them as foreigners and worries that these Galicians and other Slavs are not good materials to become British subjects. Documents of the time, statements of civic and religious leaders contain many cruel and derisive epithets. The Ottawa citizen objected to Canada, quote, being turned into a social sewage farm to purify the rinsings and leavings of rotten European states, end of quote. Even when the votes of Galicians became a prized commodity and politicians vied for them, they held these settlers in contempt and worried that they would not assimilate properly. Clifford Sifton thought he was kind when he said that he considered Galicians to be good immigrants because they were strong, worked hard, and because their stout wives produced many children. As debates thundered around them, Kuriak's people were quite unaware. They prospered, replaced their oxen with horses, built their homes, and married off their children. Perhaps they, the first generation of immigrants, did not expect too much. They were grateful for the church and school which they themselves built, and learned of their civic duties such as taxes and voting from Pocztal, the storekeeper, postmaster, who has dealings with the Angeliki, and who eventually became quite disliked by the others. Borkun, the respected leader, shows some interest in the political process, but he is inhibited by the language barrier. Thomas Bell also has a purpose for writing his novel, quote, "My conscience dictated me to write. I saw people brought here by steel magnates from the old country, and when they were exploited, ridiculed, and oppressed," wrote Bell. And further on, "My book, Out of This Furnace, is an answer to all those unthinking people who look down on the Slovaks. It was also my aim to strengthen in the Slovaks their pride of origin." He is concerned mostly with survival. Although in real life, his father, the model for Mike Dobrejčak, was very active in the Slovak community, Bell plays down most ethnic elements. There are only several Slovak expressions, several references to the social life in the Slovak hall. The reader is aware that the protagonists are Slovak, but Bell is very frugal with detail and trivia. David Denore, a scholar and an authority on Bell, interprets this as a wish to make his characters into general, universal figures. If the first novel creates an idyllic aura, the second is brutally realistic. Arrived in America, Bell writes, they were thrust, peasants and shepherds that they were, into the blast furnaces and rolling mills, and many of them paid with their lives for their unfamiliarity with the machinery and the English language. Even more bewildering were the hostility and contempt of their neighbors, the men they worked with. That hostility was epitomized in the epithet hunky, and was the most profound and lasting influence on their the lives of the Slovaks of the steel towns encountered in America. Bell shows deep insight into this psychological problem. Quote, "The first comers, Kracha's generation, never suffered the full effects of it, partly for the same reason that a prisoner who does not try to escape does not get shot at. The second generation will have more successes and more pain because of the social inequality they are subjected to." Bell continues, "This ability to shrug, to live in themselves, was the property that the first generation, and could not be handed on. Their children were born outside the walls, and there was no going back." Assimilation. In Out of This Furnace, the patriarch of the family, Kracha, is relatively happy in America, but for his wife, it was not a lucky place. What good would it do to go back with empty pockets? Still, suppose I was lucky, suppose I made a lot of money. By that time, the girls would be big. They were all born here. They're more American than anything else. Braddock is no paradise, I'll admit, but have you forgotten how we had to live in the old country? Kracha has no nostalgia for home and does not want to work on the land. Continues. Elena would rather that I bought a farm, but I got all I wanted of farming in the old country. Here it is, that famous phrase, the old country. It serves as a benchmark, a turning point. Soon Elena falls sick and dies. She could not adapt. The rest of the family is now ready for Americanization to begin. Their assimilation process develops in a series of steps, each marking an attempt to get justice, to be treated fairly, to be recognized. As stated before, the children and grandchildren cannot suffer insults in silence. Kracha's son-in-law, Michal, or Mike Dobrejczak, is the idealist who wants to change the world to lessen the exploitation. He dies before he can do it. The grandson, John Dobrejczak, you notice the name getting simpler, known as Dobby, acts out his anger and becomes a union leader and the first real American in the family. This Americanization by anger and furious action differs greatly from what occurs in the sons of the soil. Here, the moment of acknowledgement of the new rootedness of the settlers comes early in the novel, at the gravesite of a little boy, the first person to die in the colony. Speaking of Vorkun, Kuriak writes, quote, and he could never forget that moment when, returning home, he noticed the large poplar cross and the small, still fresh grave of Semen Vakar. Then he stopped, took off his cap, made a sign of the cross, and said to Solvi and Vakar, well, brothers, Canada is beginning to be ours forever. Ukrainians, it seems, are people given to symbolism and ceremony, and this dramatic ritual is marked clearly. It is a grand geste, naturalization by pronouncement, by a fiat. Self-esteem. A marked difference between the novels lies in the fact that Thomas Bell's protagonists, all generations, are absorbed by their fast-paced lives within the community, which is part of the large community of workers in Braddock, and in the time of the union strikes, the whole industrial region becomes a community. They may be hunkies, but they are part of the mass. There is no messenger from the outside coming to evaluate them. Kuriak, on the other hand, has several evaluative passages, that is, critical opinions, and they come from the mouths of outsiders. The foreigner son of foreigner in quotation marks, son-in-law of Raccoon, Bill Pickle, and the new teacher, Goodwin, carry on long conversations about these people, how good and interesting they are, and how little it would take to make them completely civilized and acceptable. Many years later, Goodwin returns on a social visit, and he is amazed how well everyone has done. Thus, the final approval comes from the hungry. Such a need of approval by foreigners is psychologically significant. It seems to be a perennial concern of Ukrainians. What will they think of us? It points to a major complex of the first generation immigrant, but it is visible in the sons and grandsons also. Kuriak goes to great lengths to paint his protagonists with strong, flattering brush. For example, he describes in great detail the wedding of Elisabetta, the second daughter of Borkun, with the rich Angli-built pickle. The barriers between the couple were broken by a common love of horses. She is about to leave the community because he's taking her away. But they throw her a wedding with every ritual prescribed by tradition. After many years on that prairie, no detail seems to have been forgotten. Ethnographers Voropai and Kilimnik would probably verify every custom. Such interpolation of cultural minutiae weakens the text inasmuch as it constitutes one of the least credible passages in the book. It is clear that Kuriak easily sacrificed verisimilitude for the ultimate person of presenting the settlers as possessing a rich and old culture. Ironically, the outside world did not think much of it, nor of any culture except British. What types of novels are they? Margaret Atwood claims that in Canadian literature, the protagonists are victims programmed for failure. For the hero, if such there be, she writes, there is endurance, survival, and intimately failure. According to her theory, Sons of the Soil is not a Canadian novel. Kuriak describes the endurance of his protagonist and builds up a crescendo of survival and achievement. The panorama of Borkun's memories is idyllic. Okay, I'm skipping here. He is proud of their progeny. He seemed to have accepted their values. All of the first generation remains unchanged. It is only the second generation which makes the real contacts with the outside world. It is significant that Kuriak develops fully the characters of the original settlers, chooses only several of the second generation and none of the third. Thomas Bell, on the other hand, created 4 narratives of equal heaviness. A parallel paragraph Atwood also proves that Out of This Furnace is not a real American novel, but I'll skip that. As ethnic stories, both books have enjoyed success primarily among their respective groups. A Sons of the Soils is 3 volumes printed in 3 installments. It was then had a reprint. It was very badly received by Ukrainians, by Mandrika, who is being mentioned here today. And there was a translation made by Ryerson Press, but it's not, it is terrible. It's a kind of a paraphrase rather than a translation. By contrast, the impact of Thomas Bell's book was great. He wrote 5 other books, of which this one is the best. Even as it remains a literary work, it is so realistically grounded that it has another life as an ancillary history textbook. The era Thomas Bell describes ended sometime in the 60s. As the Bessemer furnaces cooled and stopped and the air in Pittsburgh became clean, the times of these immigrant laborers and smoking chimneys became history. There have been many reprints, and it often serves as a documentation resource on an important part of the labor movement. It is often obligatory reading in courses of American industrial history, the final sentence. It is clear that both authors love the people they want to help. Strong sentiments seep through the novel. As different as they are in style and strategy, they are both valuable and both very much needed. Thank you very much for your attention.